Hi, my name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this series of videos, I'm taking a look at Karl Popper's article Science, Conjectures and Refutations. Now, in the previous video, we looked at sections 1 and 2, in which Popper sort of describes the basic ideas of his falsificationism. And starting from section 4, Karl Popper is going to be talking a lot about induction and how he believes that he has been able to solve the problem of induction. Between those two parts of the article, there is this little section 3, which I want to talk about in this video. And in section 3, Popper is concerned to distinguish himself and distinguish his own ideas from those of his contemporaries in philosophy of science, the logical positivists, and especially also Ludwig Wittgenstein. Now, one of the things that we are going to notice when we read section 3, or at least when we read section 3 and we know something about Wittgenstein's Tractatus, is that Popper is going to be massively wrong about Wittgenstein. In general, I would say that Popper is kind of bad at reading other philosophers and sort of presenting them in a correct, justifiable way of doing justice to the thought of other people. I think this is a weakness that even Popper's admirers might want to acknowledge. Now, in this particular case, there is an attenuating circumstance, which is that a lot of people in this era misinterpret Wittgenstein in the same way that Popper did. Okay, so let's look at that. But first of all, before I want to look at what Popper says about Wittgenstein and why we might disagree with that, let me say something about the positive points, the points about his own philosophy that Popper wants to make in this section 3. So one thing that he wants to do is he wants to make a very sharp distinction between two different problems. There is, first of all, the problem that Popper himself was concerned with, the problem of distinguishing science from pseudoscience, something that we also call the demarcation problem. So distinguishing science from pseudoscience, and that is what falsificationism is supposed to do, right? It is supposed to tell us, well, this is a scientific theory and this is a pseudoscientific theory. Or maybe this is a scientific way of acting with theories and this is a pseudoscientific way of going about, theorizing and testing theories and so on and so forth. So it's about this distinction between science and pseudoscience. Well, there's a different distinction which was very, very important for Wittgenstein and for the logical positivists, which is the distinction between the meaningful and the meaningless. So one of the core ideas of logical positivism is that metaphysics, or what has standardly been known as metaphysics, is not false and is not true either, but is meaningless. So if you look at something like, let's say, Moritz Schlick's article on Die Wende der Philosophie, so the turning point of philosophy, you will find that his point there is that the old metaphysics is meaningless. It literally doesn't say anything. If you look at the very famous article by Karl on the overcoming of metaphysics through the logical analysis of language, de Überwindung der Metaphysik durch logische Analyse der Sprache, you will find the same thing, right? What Karl is going to say is that the only meaningful statements are empirical statements, and that metaphysics, which turns out to be not empirical, in fact doesn't say anything at all. And that might not be so bad, Karl would add, if they knew that, if they were aware of that, and if they sort of were open about that. But they're not, right? The metaphysicians think that they have contentful theories, which might be true or false, and that's where everything goes wrong. So how do we make that distinction between the meaningful and the meaningless? Well, for the logical positivists, the distinction is between those statements that might be verified through experience and those statements that might not be verified through experience. So statements that say something about our observations or our possible observations, and statements that say nothing about our observations or possible observations. It's the first that have meaning, It is the second that have no meaning, that are meaningless. Okay. What Popper wants to do in this section 3 is, well, for him the most important thing is to pull those two questions apart, right? And to insist that he was always interested in the question of demarcation, and that his falsificationism was always meant to be a criterion of demarcation, to get science away from pseudoscience. And that he was never interested in or trying to give an answer to the problem of meaning and meaninglessness. So falsificationism is not supposed to be a criterion of meaning. And so what Popper does is he says, well, what I did was I attacked this verifiability criterion of meaning, basically by pointing out that even scientific theories are not verifiable. You can never prove them through observation, which is true if we think about it in a sort of practical sense. Although that, I would say, that maybe is not what the logical positivists were presumably never unaware of that. But okay, Popper points out that you can't, in practice at least, verify any statement. And to sort of say, well, but people misunderstood me, right? They always tended to think that I too was talking about meaning, because all these other guys were talking about meaning, and people still represent me as being one of the participants in that discussion, and I wasn't. And so he ends with these, incredibly Popperian sentences at the end of the paragraph, where he says, "Criticism of my alleged views was widespread and highly successful. I have yet to meet a criticism of my views." Right? So his point is that, okay, people have been criticizing him, but they've never criticized what he actually meant. They've only criticized what people thought he meant. All right. Maybe that's true at the time of writing. Maybe that's not true at the time of writing. Certainly, there have been a lot of very serious criticisms of what Popper actually meant in the decades, in later decades. Okay. It is perhaps a bit ironical that Popper sort of insists here that, people have just been criticizing his alleged views and not his real views in a paragraph in which he has just been criticizing Wittgenstein for what we can only call Wittgenstein's alleged views, and certainly not Wittgenstein's real views. So let's look at what Popper has to say about Wittgenstein in the beginning of section 3. And I'll read out a couple of sentences. Wittgenstein, as you all know, tried to show in the Tractatus that all so-called philosophical and metaphysical propositions were actually non-propositions or pseudo-propositions, that they were senseless or meaningless. All genuine or meaningful propositions were truth functions of the elementary or atomic propositions which described atomic facts, that is, facts which can in principle be ascertained by observation. Most of that is basically true. Right? So what Wittgenstein does in the Tractatus is he tells us that a lot of the sentences that we usually use actually turn out not to have any meaning. So that is first of all true for all the sentences of logic. Because when we think about it, logic never describes anything in the world. And to be a meaningful sentence is to be a sentence that might be true or false about the world, that could be made true or false by the way that the facts are. So logical sentences are meaningless, but they're not nonsense, right? They have no sense, they're not meaningful, but they're sort of at the edge of the meaningful. They sort of give us the structure of meaningful sentences, something like that. There are other sentences, however, which are not at the edge of the meaningful, but like way beyond the meaningful. They're not really sentences, actually, because they have absolutely no connection at all to facts in the world. And all the sentences of philosophy and metaphysics might be thought to fall under that. Right? So when I say something like, Wittgenstein gives us some really weird examples, like let's say Socrates is identical. Okay. but also some more philosophically sounding examples. I don't know, something like, this is not an actual example of Wittgenstein, but something like, truth is more real than beauty, or something like that. That would be a kind of sentence that doesn't, is in no way connected to any of the occurring facts in the world. And for Wittgenstein, this is going to be a meaningless sentence. And all philosophical theories are such meaningless sentences. And what we have to do in philosophy is not find the right theory, but recognize the meaninglessness of all these ways of speaking. So I guess we can agree with Popper about what he says here about Wittgenstein, more or less at least, up until the last few words. So the last few words is where Popper has talked about atomic facts, like the basic facts in the world, according to Wittgenstein, the facts that's from which the world is sort of built up. And then he says, well, that is, facts which can in principle be ascertained by observation. And let me read the next sentence too. In other words, meaningful propositions were fully reducible to elementary or atomic propositions. That's right, Wittgenstein says that. Which were simple statements describing possible states of affairs. Yeah, that's also okay. And which could in principle be established or rejected by observation. That is absolutely false as a reading of Wittgenstein's Tractatus. There is nothing in the Tractatus that suggests that atomic facts or atomic sentences have anything to do with observation. There is nothing in the Tractatus about how we could know atomic facts, about the circumstances under which we might be justified in speaking atomic sentences. In fact, Wittgenstein doesn't even seem to be committed to the idea that atomic sentences can sort of be expressed in our normal human languages with the words that we usually use. In fact, for Wittgenstein, atomic sentences are just strings of names of sort of simple, irreducible objects. They're really weird entities, right? Wittgenstein has philosophical reasons for positing these entities, these atomic facts and these atomic sentences and these atomic objects and these elementary names, simple objects, elementary names. But he never links any of them up with an epistemological theory or a theory of science, right? He never tells us that what he's talking about are sort of elementary elements of perception or something like that. And in fact, this whole epistemological dimension just doesn't exist in the Tractatus. It's nowhere there in the text. So to read Wittgenstein as somebody who gives a verifiability criterion of meaning, as someone who links meaning with what we can see or verify or ascertain or any other epistemological term, that is just a misreading of the Tractatus. It's not there in the text. And in fact, there would seem to be pretty good reasons to believe that Wittgenstein couldn't even link it up in this way with verifiability. So here's one thing that we know that Wittgenstein tells us about the elementary sentences. No two elementary sentences can come into conflict. They can never contradict each other. They can also never imply each other. They're all like completely independent, logically independent. Okay, so what would a basic observation sentence look like? Well, here's an attempt to say something very, very basic, like, I have a green impression in this part of my visual field. Right? Maybe something like that. I have a green impression in this part of my visual field. Or maybe, if we want to talk about things, if we think that observation is of things, we might want to say, I see a green plant over there. Okay. Now, clearly, those claims are incompatible with other claims that have as much of a right to be called observation statements. Namely, the claim that I don't see anything right now. Or the claim that I see red in this little part of my visual field. Or, if we talk about things again, the claim that the plant is dyed and withered and brown. I mean, yeah, of course there are all kinds of conflicts and implications and logical relations between our observation statements. And that just goes to show, I would say, for the Wittgenstein of the Tractatus, that observation statements are already bizarrely complicated things which are built up in ways that we may not even be able to grasp from the atomic sentences. Okay, so what are the atomic sentences? Well, Wittgenstein never tells us, right? And he doesn't claim to know. All of that might be very problematic for Wittgenstein, and the later Wittgenstein is not going to go into talking about atomic sentences or facts or so anymore, presumably because he too comes to the conclusion that it's kind of problematic. But one thing that is clear is that Wittgenstein is not giving the kind of theory that Popper says he is giving. And I would say that this holds for, this entire stuff about observation. It also holds for the following. Here's what Popper writes. He says, it was just this interest in the problem of the scientific character of theories. It was just this interest which made me see at once that Wittgenstein's verifiability criterion of meaning was intended to play the part of a criterion of demarcation as well. Wittgenstein's criterion of demarcation is verifiability. Demarcation is making a distinction between science and pseudoscience. And Wittgenstein in the Tractatus never talks about pseudoscience. Right? That is not something that interests him at all. So how can Popper see that Wittgenstein meant his criterion to be a criterion to distinguish between science and pseudoscience, when Wittgenstein, for all that we can read in the text, has never even thought about the distinction between science and pseudoscience, and at the very least doesn't seem to be interested in it. So, this is a weird dialectical move to make. What I think is perhaps true is that a lot of the logical positivists read Wittgenstein as having a theory that was about observations, and that some of the logical positivists thought that, using that kind of theory might be able to distinguish science from... Well, again, I'm not sure that many of them are interested in the distinction between science and pseudoscience. They're more interested in the distinction between science and metaphysics, but okay. At least we're a bit closer to what Popper is saying when we move from Wittgenstein to maybe some of the other logical positivists to some of the logical positivists, because I don't think Wittgenstein should really be called a logical positivist. Okay, let me say one more thing about that. Right? Popper is claiming that according to Wittgenstein and the logical positivists, scientific theories are supposed to be verifiable by experience, and he himself says that they are not, right? And so they are wrong. But when we look at the Tractatus, which doesn't say that much about science, but it says some things about science, well, the status of scientific theories, Wittgenstein has some rather subtle things to say about that. So he talks about Newtonian mechanics. And he doesn't say that Newtonian mechanics is a theory that is meaningful in his sense of being about the atomic facts, being a description of atomic facts, being a claim about which atomic facts are there in the world. So he's not saying that Newtonian mechanics is a statement about the world. And so even if you misinterpret him in thinking that atomic facts are supposed to be observational facts, even then Wittgenstein is not saying that Newtonian mechanics is empirical, that we can verify it. Instead, what Wittgenstein says is that Newtonian mechanics is more something like a recipe. It is a recipe for building up descriptions of systems. It tells you to describe systems in terms of forces and masses and accelerations and stuff like that. And the results of that might turn out to be better or worse. And Wittgenstein is very open about the fact that, you can't say that such a theory is false or true. What you can say is that it allows us to describe the world with a particular precision. So it could turn out that it allows us to describe the world with very little precision. It could also turn out that it allows us to describe the world with perfect precision. But that seems to be the standard of evaluation here. And so what Wittgenstein is doing is he is certainly not claiming that something like Newton's theory is a verifiable statement, or, if we have a good interpretation of the Tractatus, he's not saying that it is some complex, some truth function of elementary statements. It plays a different kind of role. A role about which maybe much more might be said, but certainly not the role that, according to Popper, scientific theories play in Wittgenstein's thinking. Okay, so actually this video turned out to be maybe more about Wittgenstein than about Popper. There are some important elements about Popper's self-image and sort of the way that he thinks his thinking is distinguished from other people's thinking in the paragraph. But in a sense, maybe my most important task here is also to, if you read this and you haven't read Wittgenstein, to make sure that you don't come out of this with a completely mistaken idea about Wittgenstein. All right. Starting from the next section, we're going to delve into what Popper himself tends to present as sort of his greatest, or one of his greatest accomplishments, which is solving the problem of induction.